Welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 286. Thank you for joining us. Today, Bonnie and I are joined by teacher and iconographer Joseph Bremer. Joseph explains the process of making an icon and what makes icons unique amongst religious art. He talks to us about the symbolism involved in icons and the history of icons in the Eastern and Western churches. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and director of development for Kolbe Academy.
Hi Stephen, how's your afternoon going?
Afternoon is going well. It's my youngest son's birthday today, so if we make it through this podcast without an interruption, I will be shocked and amazed because there's been regular check-ins. He's very excited.
Well, for sure. Happy birthday to him. That's very exciting. And to you, it's a special day. Happy Dad Day. Here to shed some light on icons and the process of their creation is iconographer Joseph Bremer. Hi, and welcome to the Kolbecast.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure.
Would you tell us a bit about yourself and your background and your Kolbe connection?
Sure. My name is Joseph Bremer. I'm currently a high school history and art teacher at Holy Family Classical School in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My headmaster at the school right now is actually Mr. Everett Boyarsky, who I think has quite the Kolbe connection.
Yep.
And then my wife, Monnica, formerly Prudlo, now Monnica Bremer, went to Kolbe, and then Miss Therese Prudlo is my mother-in-law, and I believe still teaches there.
Yep. I'm very happy to add you to our Prudlo collection because we've visited with Don and Therese and Monica several times and Peter as well. So a happy day to get to visit with you as well and hear about iconography. I'm curious about your experience of classical education, both as a student and as a teacher. So you've experienced it on both sides. Would you say a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. I wasn't really a student in any like classical curriculum until I was an undergraduate at the University of Dallas. So I went to a Catholic school from K through 8, or really pre-K through 8. And that was very, very good, but it wasn't classical. But I would say it was very important to me. And then I went to kind of really big public high schools. Specifically in Dallas, those schools can get very, very big.
Yeah.
And there was some things there that were good for me, but I didn't really know what classical education was at that point either. And I knew that having come from Catholic school in elementary and middle school, and then having seen what life without that was, I really wanted to return to it, and I didn't really know what exactly that would look like. But to be honest, like I kind of just wanted the exact opposite of the massive Dallas public high school. And so that's what kind of drove me to University of Dallas. And there were some other things that attracted me to it as well, but that was really it. And so I went to the University of Dallas, like not really knowing what the Iliad was, not really knowing who Homer was, not knowing really anything about great books. And that's kind of where I was exposed to all of that. And now I teach it at the high school level. So full circle there.
Yeah. Okay, so the topic of icons is woven throughout the history studies of our students here at Kolbe. Several years ago, I found a small reproduction icon in what one might call an antique mall or vintage store, or like, a place filled mostly with bric-a-brac, like stuff, basically.
Yeah.
And the icon featured like 3 figures in faded greenish tones that had clearly seen brighter and more colorful days, but I was really attracted to it and I brought it home. A good deal later, I was delighted to see the image in full color somewhere online and learned that it is a depiction of the Trinity by 15th century Russian painter Andrei Rublev. So I was very excited to finally learn, what is this? Because there was nothing on it to tell me what it was. So just that kind of natural beauty drawing me to it, I think. So I was grateful for that moment and kind of redeemed that trip to that antique mall. Right?
Yeah. It speaks to the really like how those really truly holy images created with a good end. I mean, they are just naturally attractive. They just speak to you spiritually, and you don't necessarily always understand why.
Yeah, yeah. It was a real gift, and I still have it. And thought of that when the topic came up. I remember visiting with Therese off and on about your work as an iconographer. So I'm glad to get to hear it straight from you today. When you are introducing iconography to someone, or explaining to someone the work that you do as an iconographer, how do you like to start?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think to start, you need to draw some sort of distinction between an icon and a piece of religious art, because a lot of religious art is iconography, but not all of it. And so I guess the first distinction I would make um, is that an icon is uh, a depiction of the saint as they truly are right now in heaven, versus a lot of religious imagery is depicting the saint as they were before, or depicting something that remains of that person. But an icon, a lot of times it's kind of clad in gold. Um, their face isn't super emotional, um, but still very solemn, at peace. And we're kind of the work of iconography is the work of trying to kind of show how that saint is in heaven right now in the present. And so in that sense, it's you could say it's like a truer depiction of that saint. So I guess that's where I would probably start.
I have to say that I hadn't ever heard that before.
Yeah.
So actually, when you were mentioning an icon, Bonnie, I was thinking like one of my first experiences when I came into the church. A friend of mine who had worked with some Eastern monks who were doing icons, and he gave me this icon, and I looked at it and I said, "Oh, thank you so much." It was this young man holding a censer, and and I was like, "Oh, and who is this?" And he's like, "It's Saint Stephen."
Mm.
But he's not getting stoned or, the typical things, the scene from his life that I would have expected. He's there as a deacon of the church, and that makes sense. No, that's what that's how he would be now, not before he was stoned.
Yeah, what's really beautiful about that is that I like to kind of think about it like an icon or a photograph. And so if you could go back in time and like photograph Saint Stephen, and then you bring it back to 2025, um, most people would say like the photograph of Saint Stephen is actually like the better and truer depiction of him, because it's like what he actually looked like. But a photograph is capturing a moment in time, a specific moment, um, versus like an icon. It's more like what Saint Stephen, what remains of Saint Stephen, what remained of him in the photograph, what was him. But Saint Stephen kind of even kind of like with, but also kind of transcending his martyrdom in a sense, in an icon. Him and you know partaking in the glory of God, in a way that he was most fully called to in an icon. That's like an kind of the power of the sort of abstract isn't the right word, but less materialistic forms of art, I think.
How can we tell between Western iconography? I'm having a hard time with that word, iconography, and other forms, because I think the one I'm referring to is from the Orthodox tradition, right? But
Mhm.
are there big differences, and are there other distinguishing features of icons that are important to note?
It's tough because it's not exactly clear what in the West constitutes an icon in the sense I just talked about one. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Are there other distinguishing features of icons that are important to note in general that separate them from other forms of imagery?
Yes. So I would say an icon really does exist like for the purpose of being prayed with. Um, it exists, like that is what it is for. And if it isn't being used for that purpose, it isn't being used properly. And so we can think of like in Catholic homes, in my own home, like there are crucifixes I have above my doors, right? And those are beautiful, good images. But you know, we don't necessarily like stop and like say prayers using the crucifix above our door, right? So maybe sometimes we do as we leave, we say a quick blessing or something. But I think most of the time that really is meant to signify like we're asking for God's blessing over this house or the room or something like that. Or it's more of like a reminder, right? Um, or there are even like images of Christ that maybe we place in certain places that are meant to be like a reminder of his presence. Or you can even think of like if you use an image of Christ as your screensaver on your phone or your laptop or something. You usually, maybe sometimes you do, but um, it's not often that you like pull up your screensaver and like use it to pray. Um, but an icon exists like for that purpose. And so if you're placing an icon somewhere, sort of the understanding is that that saint is like truly present in a way in that icon. And so as such, um, it really ought to be used to facilitate prayer in a way that not all art is, even not all religious art.
You're saying that makes sense now that we've started first with the premise of that the icon is the present, whereas other art is a depiction of a certain thing. So now when you're approaching this it should be, if I'm understanding here properly, it should be like looking into the eyes of this saint and saying, let's pray together. Let us be together, let's offer up these prayers together, or maybe asking his intercession, whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there is that's exactly right. That there's an understanding of that the saint is present. Like the Greek word is ousia, his like essence in a sense. It's actually like in the icon, in a way that like if I took a picture of you and I could show that to someone you know and they would be able to identify you, right? Um, but an icon would be different because it isn't just a moment in time in a way that a photo would, right? And so Saint Paul, like what are you recognizing when you see an image of Saint Paul? The claim by many iconographers, especially Eastern iconographers, but some in the West too, um, depending on how you understand like substances, is that like Saint Paul's like really present in that in a way, uh, because his depiction is there, and because it's made for a purpose, that being like prayer to Saint Paul. And so those two things really align, right? The essence is there, and then you're also like in praying to Saint Paul, using the icon of Saint Paul, you're making that like even more real, because we believe that the saints are still alive and actively interceding for us, and we can do that even better using a true depiction of him.
I've heard you mention a couple times references to Western and Eastern iconography. How do we tell between them? And do you specialize in one or the other?
Yes, well, I'm trying to, anyways. I'm trying to. The distinction falls away the earlier you get, I think. So some of the earliest icons we have actually are in Rome. When we think of icons, I think a lot of the times we think of Eastern icons, but the catacombs of Rome have like the earliest depictions of Christ and the saints. Part of that is because in the East, in the late 500s and in the 600s, and even in part of the 700s, there were this move towards something called iconoclasm, the destruction of icons. And so even though there are icons that exist in the East that predate iconoclasm, most of them were destroyed when these Byzantine emperors came through and they went on like these mass purges of images. And so so there are these like Western images that look a lot like what we would now call Eastern icons, but I would not draw a distinction. I think that tradition belongs to the West as well. But you do start getting distinctions starting in like the 700s. So as a result of this iconoclasm, the destruction of icons, an ecumenical council is called by the Byzantine Empress Irene, and this is the Second Council of Nicaea. So you have the first one, which is way more famous, but there's the second one, the Second Council of Nicaea, and this is kind of colloquially known as the triumph of orthodoxy, not the Orthodox Church, but the triumph of right belief, because at this ecumenical council they say formally that the veneration of icons is good, right, and true, and should be encouraged. And so that really takes shape starting in the East in the 700s, the late 700s. Now, in the West, they had kind of developed their own art style that it was really developing from iconography, something called the Carolingian style, really under the Emperor Charlemagne, but a little bit before that too. And the West was a little bit less eager to accept the Second Council of Nicaea. They weren't like just openly hostile to it, but in the East they said, okay, now we can venerate icons. We're going to really start doing it. And in the West, they were a little more cautious, and so that kind of developed a bit differently. And so really, I would say starting in the 800s, you start getting these two really sharply distinct styles. The kind of Byzantine iconography, really the heart of which is the city of Constantinople. And then this sort of Carolingian style of art, which is encouraged by some of the popes and really by the Emperor Charlemagne. So the West, they still have these iconographical tropes, these kind of themes and these motifs, these similarities. And it still does have that sense of what an icon is, right? Something that depicts the saint as they actually are, outside of time. And that stays the same in the 900s and in the 1000s and in the 1100s and even in the Romanesque and in the Gothic periods. That stays the same. And in the East, I think it's fair to say that they develop a lot less. They grab hold of these styles of iconography, and they do develop, but it's a lot slower. And so it looks a lot more like what it looked like in the 700s and before. And so whereas in the West, we're in the 1000s now, and we're experimenting with all sorts of painting. In the East, they're still kind of practicing traditional iconography. And I think it's fair to say that the West does start to kind of lose what an icon is supposed to mean by probably the late 12 and the early 1300s. You have some really beautiful art coming out. This is really the flowering of the 12th and the 13th centuries. Painters like Cimabue, painters like Giotto, the Sienese school of painting. There are still real similarities with iconography, but they're developing kind of more into depicting things that remain, right? Scenes from the Bible, scenes of martyrdom, altarpieces that depict things that aren't quite eternal in the same way that the presence of a saint is. And that is going to really give flower to the painting of the Renaissance, which, as Westerners, is viewed as a pretty positive thing, which is okay. I think there's a lot of good in the Renaissance, but it is a departure, I think, from in some ways the tradition of icons that did remain more consistent in the East.
Okay.
It sounds like that original meaning that was held more constant in the East than just, as you're saying, just kind of disappears a little bit. Like okay, no, we're just looking at art to call scenes to mind now, and maybe not. I mean, to encourage prayer and holy thoughts and recollections, but not the kind of the presence like you were talking about before.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Conversational aspect of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not to say that like the West wasn't okay for kind of developing that into something new. But there are pros to the East kind of not developing it as much, and there are cons, and I guess that's just kind of where we are now. Is the West moved on from that in a real way? Not entirely, not entirely. But I think like that real presence aspect to, I know that has Eucharistic kind of connotations, but the real presence of the saint in an icon, I think the West kind of kept that more in things like the veneration of relics, whereas the East really stuck to the idea that the saint like really is present in the image, in a way that I think the West, especially with sort of the rise of Aristotle in the West in the 1200s, the West kind of moved on a little bit from that.
With that long, with that long sort of tradition in the East, are there rules then as far as like if you are depicting this saint, you must have this, or you need these proportions, or certain things like that are required?
Yeah, absolutely there are. I don't know if I could point you to like a rule book, but if there was one, it would be huge. There's quite a lot. I mean, there is a real virtue to like putting the brakes on, and saying, no, if we're going to be depicting Christ and it's in the truest way that we can, like this is how we do it. Because if it's beautiful, then it also needs to be true. And so we have to say that for art as well, right? So there are like truer ways of depicting Christ than other ways, or truer ways of depicting Saint Paul or anyone else than other ways. Most of the time, like saints are, and even Christ is depicted in like clothes of nobility. So if you think of like an icon of Christ, he's usually in like a blue and a red robe, and those were like noble robes. Something that Christ would have almost certainly like never worn in his time on earth, right? Or things like what the hand signs mean, like certain signs are made by saints, they indicate certain types of blessings. I need a reference book to remember all of it, to be honest. It's a lot. There are rules though, like you are not supposed to paint God the Father in an icon, because Exodus forbids depictions of God, and the only reason we can depict God now is that God took on flesh and kind of gave us an image, right? But we still shouldn't do that for the Father, with the exception of the Andrei Rublev Trinity icon that was mentioned before. That's like basically it. It's basically it. And so, yeah, lots of rules. Colors really do have like quite a lot of meaning. Like greens and icons depict like a pretty earthly tie. Reds, I mean, kind of passion, like fieriness in the good way, but also a sort of stability. And I could go on and on, but
Yeah.
meanings for everything. Meanings for everything.
That's
Yes.
interesting.
Yes, I'm glad you brought up the idea of some images. I was thinking about this as you were talking earlier, that like for the Jewish people, they didn't do any images. So we had Dr. Gilbert Lavoie came on to our podcast at one point and mentioned that, the image on the Shroud of Turin would have been burned by the Jews of the time, or the people with those traditions, because it was not allowed to have images to worship it. So it's, even when you're giving that time frame where you're looking at 700, it seems like it took a little bit of time for that even still to kind of be like, okay, this is okay. I'm sure things were developed much before that, but it still sounds like it took a bit of time to kind of even develop, I guess. But
yeah, definitely. Well, there's that discussion in Acts, right? I mean, to what extent do we as Christians need to continue to follow the Mosaic law? And this is one of those that changed, that changed because of Christ. God giving us an image of himself in a way that he didn't give to Moses, right? Moses gets to see his back. And even then, that's like almost too much. Like the glory of God is not something to be depicted lightly. And so it makes the incarnation all the more beautiful, right? That after all that time, God gave us an image of himself. Um, but but even then, it like almost all the other necessary changes instituted by Christ. It took a long time. And so it does seem like something Christians were broadly on board with in the early centuries. Um, that's why they're in the Roman catacombs, you know. But it developed a lot later, and it really iconography as we know it developed from a practice of Egyptian funeral painting. So on Egyptian mummies, these Greek Egyptian mummies, um, they would oftentimes paint the face of the deceased on the sarcophagus. And if you go and see those, you could see these in museums, especially like the British Museum nowadays. They look exactly like icons because it really wasn't until kind of later that people became more comfortable with it. And so they were, you know, what styles do we look to? How do we depict these saints and Christ and the Mother of God in kind of true ways? And they look to like this Egyptian kind of funerary painting as a way to do that.
What sparked your interest in icons and in studying them and pursuing the route you're taking now?
I've always been like kind of loosely interested in something artistic. I can say that like as a kid, I was never like really exceptional at any form of art. Um, Once I got to the University of Dallas as an undergraduate, I kind of had a group of friends, and we were all very interested in kind of beauty in its various ways. So of the three of us, one of them is finishing up his degree in kind of traditional architecture at Notre Dame right now. One of them went and learned like traditional timber framing, like building buildings out of like large logs of timber. And then I kind of wanted to pursue iconography. So there was one day I like kind of came across this book um, that was just a very kind of rudimentary step-by-step guide on how to paint. And I decided to try it with some of my friends. And so we just went to Hobby Lobby and we got like really the cheapest stuff. I mean, we were in college, you know, just the cheapest stuff. Um, I think it did not look very good by the time we were done, but we saw it through, you know, we finished it. Um, I kind of keep that icon around as like a reminder of you know that first try because I am happy that I kind of saw it through,
Yeah.
you know. But we all kind of got together and we would give stuff like that a try. We were all interested in architecture and art and things like that. And so then after that we kind of did that independently actually. Um, and then I was going to a Byzantine Catholic kind of parish in Dallas. So for those who don't know, there's like the Roman Catholic Church, so like 98% of Catholics belong to that, but there are also these kind of smaller Eastern Catholic churches that are in full communion. One of which is the Ruthenian Catholic Church, and I just fell in love with the liturgy there. It was so beautiful. And so I was going there in college, and I kind of befriended the priest there, St. Basil, in Dallas, and he was offering these kind of iconography classes, but they were just in acrylic, which is not. It was. I was so happy I'm so happy looking back that that's what it was because it was approachable, it was doable, and so kind of did like a week-long class with him. And I finished an icon of Christ that at the time I was pretty proud of. I thought it looked pretty good, and given everything, I had a very good teacher. Um, and then eventually I kept going back for classes, and I really befriended Father Elias there, Father Elias Rafaj in Dallas, and I eventually started taking it more seriously, and so um, you know, you can do acrylic icons and they can look very, very beautiful. But traditionally, icons are painted in something called egg tempera. And egg tempera is you kind of make your own paint as you go. So you take egg yolk, and you mix it with white wine or vinegar, and you kind of mix it together. And then you mix that little kind of emulsion with rock, like rock dust. And you make that as you go. And that produces like a very flat and a very blendable type of paint. That's just perfect for icons. It's how most icons are done nowadays. And that was a bit more difficult to get into in college because that pigments, rock pigments can be a little tough to get your hands on. But I started taking it more seriously. I kept at it, and then I took a few like formal classes in egg tempera painting, just week-long classes at my school in London that were very, very beneficial. And that's kind of how I really got into it.
Now I'm interested in hearing the explanation of, okay, you're sitting down to write an icon. What's the process like for that?
And why is it called writing one?
Yes, that too.
Yeah, some do say writing an icon. I guess you call it writing mainly because you're depicting something as it is currently, and so Christ says he is the Word, right? And so when you're kind of bringing that to actuality in paint, in a sense, you're like bringing the Word and those who kind of subsist in the Word in heaven, bringing that about on earth, or you're kind of depicting that in a true sense. And so writing is can be used to describe that. Process of iconography, it's quite a lot. I mean, it starts out with a gessoed board. Gesso is like this chalk dust, and you mix this chalk dust with rabbit skin glue, and you lay it out in like 20 layers, 20 very thin layers on a wood board, and you sand it in between every layer into just the smoothest possible surface. If you're doing gold leaf, if you're applying gold leaf to your icon, you do that first before you paint anything. So you get your image on the board, you draw it, and you put something called red bull clay. So it's like this hardened clay that you mix with a hide glue, and you put that on the board where you want the gold to be, and you sand that down. And it's a real beautiful process because really, like after you get the image on the board, the first thing you do to kind of start the icon is apply the gold. And the way you do that is after it's sanded, you like heat it up with your breath and like these deep, like ha breaths. And so in Genesis, when God like breathes life into man and he brings him about, you're kind of doing the same thing when you're starting an icon. And the reason you breathe these warm breaths is so that the clay gets sticky and you can apply the gold. But you're like bringing about this light with your breath. It's a beautiful process. And so you apply the gold there, and then you start painting, and you paint in, I would say if you're looking at a hand painted icon, if you're looking at like the skin, that's like at least 15 layers. At least 15 layers. It's very, very thin layers. Now, if it's an acrylic icon, it's more like 7 or 8. But very, very thin layers on top of each other. And you slowly build it up from darkness to light. And so you start out by painting everything like this kind of dark brown color. It's called a proplasmos, or the Italians a verdaccio. And you lay everything out in this dark brown, and then you start adding light colors very thinly, light colors, and you build the skin up layer by layer, and you start with redness, and then it gets lighter and lighter, and you do the same with the clothes. You start with dark and you build it up to light, and you do the hair the same, everything darkness to light, darkness to light. Eventually, once the skin is kind of built up and you've put your shadows back in, and you've gone back and forth between light and shadow and light and shadow, and it properly looks like skin. Skin is very hard to paint. So, flesh, it has such a gradient. It takes many layers. Once you've done all that, you do the details like the lips, the eyelids, and then traditionally the last thing you do is the eyes, because it doesn't quite look like a person yet. But when you add the eyes, it's just the icon just comes to life. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. The whites of the eyes, it really just comes to life. And all of a sudden, you're looking face to face at this saint. And so when you're working on icons, you aren't really listening to TV. You're not watching TV in the background or anything. You should be doing something spiritually uplifting. Ideally, you'd be spending all the time praying. I'm not quite there yet. You know, but I try and listen to maybe like religious audiobooks or good Catholic podcasts like this one or something like that. Um, and so that you really are like in a state of prayer as you're bringing about um, kind of the essence of this saint. It's a really beautiful thing.
How do you choose your topic? Who you're going to which which saint you're going to depict or write an icon for? And
Yeah,
how would you phrase that?
yeah, yeah. How do I pick the saint that's like going to be depicted? Um, to be honest, most of the time when people approach me wanting an icon, they have someone specific in mind. I think that's true. But whenever I'm just kind of creating something for myself, iconography is very spiritual, but it's also an art that needs to be developed. And so you look at previous works and you say, well, I really need to work on this. I need practice in this. And so um, it, there is a danger of not so much over spiritualizing it, but making it less practical than it actually is too. Um, so yeah, sometimes it's just a practical like, I need to practice painting clothes. I need to practice painting beards or something. So I'm going to choose a very bearded saint. Yeah, it's kind of I was last December I was the apprentice to an iconographer working in the dome of this church, and you're up 100 feet in the air, and I'll say like it's pretty difficult to be in prayer when you're like leaning over scaffolding like that or something. You really are more focused on the practicality of it.
That would be.
Yeah, yeah. So it's how do you say that? It's compromise isn't the right word, but it's both. It's spiritual and there's a pretty prominent practical element to it too.
Okay.
It sounds like even like once you pick something you want to do, there's probably, like you said, research as far as well as the different symbols and the different things that are involved, unless you're kind of just reproducing that. Am I right about that? That's part of the.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. So, well, one thing I do want to say is that you're right that you want to be very hesitant to create like new images. Like you do need to be very careful about the images you create because they need to be true. Um, um, and that does require like a lot of research, which I really like. I like kind of going into the books and seeing what people have done before, and there's a sense in which it makes you more free. It's that freedom is the ability to choose the good. And so if I were to say like paint Saint Francis of Assisi any way you want, I mean that's like really hard. But if I say like these are kind of the rules, and this is how he needs to be painted, well then like every small choice that you make actually has like a massive amount of meaning. And there is sort of stuff you can experiment with a little bit. You can experiment with color a little bit. You can experiment with um, his expression a little bit, and you can experiment with his positioning a little bit, and every small kind of nuance there. It actually is very freeing because there's a sense in which like you aren't only trying to make it look beautiful. You need to do that, but you're also like trying to make a claim about the truth of Saint Francis of Assisi, and when you're kind of acting within what seem like very, very strict rules, but when you're acting within that, it gives what you're doing way more weight, way more importance, and it yeah, it's just I find that like really, really beautiful.
When we were working on preparing for this episode, one of the points you mentioned is the role of icons in the liturgy. And we have an article that I'm going to link in our show notes that you wrote in a publication called New Liturgical Movement, where you're describing some of your thought process and some of the things you notice as an iconographer. Say a bit about the role of icons in the liturgy and why that was on your list.
Yeah. So one thing I'm very interested in is kind of taking this Western tradition of icons and because there is like specifically a Western tradition and kind of maybe reintroducing it to the extent that that's possible. So there is a difference in the role sacred images and even icons play in liturgies, really depending on whether you have a more Eastern or a more Western attitude towards things. And both are very valid. Both are fine. The Catholic Church has the Byzantine liturgy is great, and there are those who practice the Byzantine liturgy that are in full communion, you know. But I would say in the East, an icon and your prayer with an icon, it kind of exists in a liturgical way. If I'm going to make a claim that St. Paul is like really present in this icon, right? Then like heaven and earth, you know, they really are coming together in your prayer with this work, right? With this icon. And so one thing that's kind of characteristic of a lot of Eastern liturgies is you don't have pews in the church. You don't have pews. And that pews are actually a new thing. Like St. Peter's Basilica doesn't have pews. But one thing that's kind of interesting about that is that in Eastern liturgies, you can kind of like walk around the church a little bit, and it's really like not disrespectful because the church has icons all around them, and you can kind of like pray using these icons during a liturgy, right? If I did that in like a Roman Catholic church, people would be looking at me kind of funny. If I just like wandered up to a side altar and started doing my own thing, you know? But that's more acceptable. That's more acceptable. And I think it used to be more acceptable too. I mean, if you've ever been to like one of these great basilicas in Rome, there are lots of side altars where different masses would be going on at the same time as like the mass at the main altar, right? But the point there is that the icon kind of can exist outside of the liturgy. It can exist outside of the liturgy. St. Paul is just as present there during the liturgy as he might be not during the liturgy, right? There are some that might disagree with that, but I think that's a fair assessment. In the West, I would say that the West placed more emphasis on like the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Not that the East doesn't have that, but we really made that the center of everything, the center, including our art, right? And so even if we did kind of maintain that idea that the saint really was like depicted as he actually is in these images of our churches in like the 11 and 12 and even parts of the 1300s, even if we kept that idea, the artists really wanted to make sure that your focus was on the mass. And so the icons were really meant to kind of help with like narrative participation, right? The idea that like you are participating in the holy sacrifice of the mass, and that is like Jesus Christ, like he's really there in the Eucharist. And so the art around the church, that's why you don't really wander around so much. It's really more to encourage attention to be drawn in this sort of eurythmic way is the word. It really is meant to draw attention to the altar in a way that Eastern icons don't really do. So I think a fair way to really like summarize all of that is like, I can take an Eastern icon out of a church and it's still just as much an icon. It still serves its purpose. But if I were to take a Western icon outside of a church, it would lose a bit of what it was meant to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, because as you were talking about, the saint being truly present or whatever, I was thinking, okay, well, yeah, I mean, I'm a Western, Novus Ordo mass going guy. So that moment of the mass, this kind of our participating in time in something that is one event, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the life in heaven, all of the saints being there present, or the angels, they're present. It is that sort of
here's the moment, we're all together. And so I'm seeing the lining up as your description of an icon of a representation of that. So putting into through paint and through art, this being present kind of at this eternal moment, even though it's all different times, is kind of, those were the thoughts that were jumping into my head as you were explaining that, at least. I'm not sure if I've got that right or not, but
No, you do. You do absolutely have that right. And like the East certainly believes all of that is happening as well. But I think there just is more of an emphasis on that like happening, or there's more of an emphasis in like the art in Western churches drawing you to that specifically. Yeah.
right.
Well, what guidance would you have for students of any age who are inspired by this conversation, who wish to study more about it, perhaps write their own icons eventually, and delve more deeply into this?
I think I would start with, making sure that you're going into it with a prayerful mindset. And because if you go into it with a prayerful mindset, then God will show you if that's what He kind of wants you to do. Not necessarily as a career, but even just as something of a hobby or something in terms of spiritual development. Because you can. I think most of the people who have created icons aren't doing it professionally. It's more of a like spiritual practice for them because it is a form of prayer. And so pray about it. That would be my first thing, and really make sure that that's something you at least want to try, knowing all that. Um, I really think it's okay to go to Hobby Lobby and um, pick up some acrylic paints. You need a teacher, or you at the very least a book. It is a step-by-step methodical process, and go into it. A lot of times in art, we're told you need to express yourself or something, and that's not what iconography is about. And so be okay with that, making this not about you. Um, there's a process to this. There's a process that really has been perfected to this, and the more you kind of accept that, I think the better you'll do. There are some pretty good like YouTube channels out there, like Painting the Light. Painting the Light is like one of my favorites. He's a Cretan Orthodox iconographer who just does a beautiful job. And he's very kind. His videos are very, very pleasing to watch. Um, there are, some pretty inexpensive guidebooks on Amazon or anywhere that you could really get started with. There are more expensive ones, but just start with something simple, and see it through to completion. That's the big thing. Icons take a lot of time. They take a lot of time. And if you start an icon, just finish it. Just finish it. Even if you messed up on step 3 and now you're on step 300, and because you didn't do step 3 right, step 300 looks terrible. Just see it through. See it through. Finish it. Because every time I create an icon, I learn something new. And it's only because I see it through to completion. If I had made everything perfect until I moved on to the next step, I would never complete an icon, ever. So I think that's what I would say. Find a book, pray about it, and if you start, finish.
Okay. Can you give us a glimpse of what you're working on now or looking forward to?
Sure. Yeah. I have a few kind of things I'm working on. There are some folks in Tulsa who I'm creating like a kind of a Western Padre Pio icon for. I'm excited about. And I'm working on a Saint Augustine icon that has like a kind of a full gold background that I'm excited about. And I'm creating some icons for the Byzantine Catholic mission up in Tulsa, the Saint Athanasius mission. And yeah, I have a few things down the pipeline too that I'm excited about. Hopefully working with some more churches soon.
I am aware of an icon you created for, I don't even know if that's the right terminology. The University of Tulsa hosted a Boethius conference recently, for which you created an icon. So we will link some information about that. Do you want to say anything about that at this point, or send folks to read about it?
Yeah, no, it's one of those examples of an icon that didn't really exist before. And so Boethius is a very, very Western saint. I think he's only like formally a saint in the Diocese of Pavia, but I think we can call him a saint. Um, and yeah, there really weren't too many traditional images out there of him, definitely not icons. And so um, it took quite a lot of reading. Specifically, that icon, I was very, very cautious about because I was asked to paint Lady Philosophy. And if it's an icon, the question is like, does Lady Philosophy actually exist? Like right now? And I decided that like I think I could faithfully depict her in an icon because there is a tradition of personification in the iconographical tradition, and also you know, philosophy does really like come down and knock you over the head, which I'm sure some Colby students have experienced, and that's like a real phenomenon, and and so that was a yeah that icon was a real joy to work on, and an example of that kind of you can create new things and develop the art form.
Beautiful. Well, we will link to that. Is there a place you'd like to send folks to learn more about you and the work you're doing in iconography?
Sure. Yeah, I have a small website. It's mostly just some of my work and some of my articles, but it's www.romanesqueicons.com. The Romanesque is this kind of style of Western iconography I'm studying. And yeah, there's a little bit of my biography, some stuff I'm writing. I have a few articles, and then that's like kind of my portfolio.
Great. Be sure to link that. Okay. So here's where I usually say, check the show notes for all these links and relevant Kolbecast episodes and so forth. Stephen, was there anything that we didn't get to that you would like to before we wrap up with Joey?
I thought this was great. This was really insightful. Yeah.
Real pleasure.
I found it fascinating. Yeah, and I'm going to be looking at the icons I encounter in a whole new light. Well, what a pleasure this has been. Thank you so much for coming to visit with us.
Thanks very much. It was a real pleasure and an honor.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam.